think are some of the similarities or some of the threats of what's going on in Europe versus here?
The broad problem of Islamism is roughly the same in Europe and the United States, but there are significant differences. For example, the socioeconomic and educational levels of Muslims in the United States are much higher. We have a lot more doctors and engineers. They have a lot more street sweepers and factory hands. We have a large indigenous population of Muslim converts, especially blacks. They don't have anything like that. We have a much more assimilationist culture than they do. If you look at a country like Sweden or the Netherlands, they're essentially one large family, and only of late have immigrants come, and they don't really fit in. We're not a family. We have all sorts of different people from all over the world, and so it's much easier to assimilate. So in general, things are better in the United States. There's certainly a threat of the United States going the direction of Europe, in part as the Muslim population grows here and becomes as large, 5 times as small as it is in Europe. As it grows, one feels Muslim politicians and others, or Islamist politicians, throwing around their weight. Yes, there's certainly a danger. I, as an American, look at Europe as an example of what we don't want to do and mistakes we don't want to make. Well, first, I think that people have become far more aware. If I contrast today with 25 years ago, there's no comparison. There's just so much more knowledge. For example, 10 years ago, I couldn't use the word jihad. Now I do routinely. I don't explain what it means. People know what it means. So it's happening. The drumbeat of events is forcing people to learn about Islam in a way that, say, they don't feel forced to learn about Buddhism. So it's happening. But if one wants to learn more, well, there are a whole lot of books. I discourage reading the Quran. It's an extremely difficult book. One can't really understand it, reading in translation on one's own. I would recommend instead reading history books, getting some sense of the background. Yeah, there's a huge debate over the word terrorist. There's no real accepted definition. You know, one can argue endlessly over who's a terrorist and who's not. I think more important for my purposes is to look at the motives, and whether the person carries a card from Al-Qaeda or not is not the important part. It's the motives. If there's a jihadi motive, if there's a motive to build Islam and Islamic supremacism, then that's what counts. And whether it's terrorism or not is not the key thing. So the important thing for me is knowing which instances are cases of Islamist aggression. And the problem there is that there's almost collusion between law enforcement, politicians, and the media not to tell us this information. Just a couple of days ago, there was an attack in Santa Monica by someone with an Arab name. We have no idea what his motives were, whether it was criminal or some kind of family tension, whether he's Muslim or not. Why did he have 1,300 rounds of ammunition with him as he left the house? We don't know. And in all likelihood, we won't know, because the media doesn't really look into this, the politicians don't look into it, and law enforcement, if it does look into it, doesn't tell us.
And why do you think there is, I guess it's almost like a cover-up?
I think the agenda is actually a benign one. It's not political correctness, it's not euphemism, it's not fearfulness. Rather, it's twofold. On the one hand, worrying that if you talk about Islam in any way, you will rile up other Muslims who will then potentially become violent. So best not to mention that. And secondly, there's a sense, accurate, that if you talk about Islam, then you have to follow up on it. So for example, if you talk about Islam, take something like airplane security, which we're all familiar with, it means you have to focus in on the Muslims. And there's a deep reluctance to do that. So better to pretend there's really no distinction between people. It's just a matter of who carries an arm or not. And look for weapons and not look at people. Because it implies a lot about the ordering of American society.